Hey everybody, welcome back to Biblical Greek Made Easy. This is class 8 of module 2, and today we're going to learn the aorist and future passives, okay? We've put these off for a fair amount of time. We learned future a while ago, and we told you we'd learn passive later on. We've learned both first aorist and second aorist, and so we're finally going to learn the passives today. We're going to learn all those together because they're formed so similarly. Okay, but before we get into that, let me give you the scripture verse of the day. 1 Thessalonians 5:11 says, "Therefore encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing." In other words, Paul's talking to the Thessalonians and saying, I know you guys are already doing this, but keep building one another up. Keep encouraging one another. Because guys, that's so important. Encouragement is so important in life and on this Greek journey. And so I hope you have some encouragement and some support in your life. Maybe you have somebody going on this Greek journey with you, and if so, that's awesome. Be sure to encourage one another and build each other up, pick one another up, sit with each other, stand with each other during those hard times. Maybe you're doing this by yourself. Maybe you could bring somebody else along. Maybe at this point in your Greek journey, you could reach out to a friend and tell them about Biblical Greek Made Easy and have them come along, and you could be their tutor, their teacher, help them along as they're going through the Biblical Greek Made Easy journey. And here's the thing, when we help other people learn, that helps us learn as well, okay? And so let me encourage you with that. Maybe consider doing that as you're going along in this Greek journey. We want to pay it forward, we want to help others out, and we want to encourage one another, okay? And so here's the tip of the day. Today's tip of the day is to trust the process and do your best, okay? We're giving you a process to identify these verbs, okay? And we want you to trust that process. At the end of the day, do your best. Some things are going to fall outside of that process we've given you. It's not foolproof. Sometimes weird stuff gets through, and we're just going to do our best in times like that, okay? Greek is too complex. Actually, any language is too complex to memorize every single weird feature that happens, at least right away, at least as a beginner, okay? And so that's really one of the keys to learning Greek is don't get too bogged down with the randomness of it, the seeming randomness of it, but just keep going, do your best, encourage yourself, encourage one another, and we'll get through this together, okay? So with that, let's talk about why this matters, okay? So we've learned the active and the middle forms of both the future and the aorist. We still need to learn the passive forms though, okay? We've put that off until now. And so these are regular enough that we need to learn to recognize them. You may think to yourself, like, do I really need to know the passives of these, couple tenses? Like, you know what, I'm just gonna skip these. We need to know these because they're regular, okay? And they show up a fair amount, and we're going to be a little bit handcuffed if we don't know how these forms show up and how to recognize them in the New Testament. So we need to do our due diligence and figure this out. And guys, let me tell you, this is the last class period that this kind of weird verb stuff is going on. Next class period is going to feel like a breath of fresh air as we learn a new tense that's just going to be really recognizable. It's going to be fun when we get there before we move into participles, which are a little bit of a different turn, and so we'll talk about that when we get there. But we need to be able to recognize the passives, okay? So passive verbs, remember that so far we've only learned passive verbs for the present and the imperfect, okay? But we have seen passive verbs before. The future and aorist, we've just learned the middle but not the passive, and so you remember how passives are formed. I was thrown out the window. That would be an aorist passive. Past tense, the verb is receiving the action, or the subject is receiving the action of the verb, okay? It's not performing the action, it's receiving the action. So I was thrown is how we do that in English. And then the future would be I will be thrown out the window. So we have that will, which tells us in English that it's a future, but the be thrown, we put be in there to make it passive, okay? So we have those helping words in English to make it so that the subject is receiving the action of that verb, okay? It's like, remember we saw before, it's like that arrow gets turned around where the action kind of goes the other direction, okay? So when we talk about passive, that's what we mean. We learn aorist and future passive together because they're so similar in the way they're formed, and you'll see what I mean here in just a second. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and build the first aorist passive indicative. Here we go. So we're going to start out with an augment at the front. Okay, remember augment is that epsilon on the front, indicates past time, kind of like a timeline looking backwards that reminds us that it's past time. Then we're going to use the aorist passive tense stem, but remember I call it the present tense stem because it's that regular stem that we learned with the present. It's the lexical form stem. It's what we are good at recognizing. It's fairly straightforward. Okay. Then we're going to put a tense formative in here, and in this case, it's going to be a theta eta. Okay, the tense formative is theta eta. Okay, we haven't seen that yet. That's a different tense formative. But here's the good news about that. That's different enough. It's not like a sigma epsilon or something like that. It's a theta eta. It stands out, and that's going to scream to you that it's passive. This is going to be the international sign of the passive, particularly the theta. But here, that theta eta equals passive. We want to burn that into our brains, okay? And then, after that tense formative, that passive aorist tense formative, we're going to add secondary active personal endings. I know that's weird, okay? These are passive verbs, so you think they'd be middle passive endings, but for whatever reason, aorist likes to take these active endings for the passive, okay? So just think about that tense formative as like being more powerful than the endings, okay? That theta eta is strong enough to force the word to be passive, and so it can take any endings at once. I mean, not really, but that's kind of what's happening. It's taking these different endings that don't exactly fit, but that is what it is, okay? So we end up with eluthane, okay? So could you recognize the augment on the front of that and the lexical form in the middle? Okay. Now notice, almost every time that you see the theta eta, you can assume the verb is aorist passive. Okay, there's like two tiny caveats to that we'll talk about here in just a minute, but learn to trust that theta eta, okay? I've heard it said before, you could think about it this way. Theta eta kind of looks like the English word they, it's they. So you could think they are passive. They are passive, okay? That's maybe a way to put a little mental hook in there to hang that on. But theta eta screams passive to you, okay? All right, so let's look at the paradigm. Here's what the paradigm looks like. Eluthane, eluthase, eluthe, eluthamen, elutheta, eluthason. Okay? So relatively straightforward with the exception of third person plural, which is a little bit different. Okay? We have son on the end there. Okay? That's new. Notice we don't have a movable new on the third person singular. But other than that, pretty straightforward. Okay, if you saw eluthase in context, could you recognize it and parse it? Okay, we've got to make sure we know those endings well enough. We got to make sure we know these parts, the tense formatives and that sort of thing. But this is what the paradigm looks like, okay? Maybe a little scary, but again, if we trust the process and do our best, we're going to recognize those parts for what they are. Okay, so where's the weirdness? We've talked about this before. We want to look for the weirdness in any new thing that we're learning. Well, active instead of passive endings, that's a little strange, especially if you use the endings as a clue to help you identify what's going on with the word. That could be a little tricky for you, so we have to remember that the theta eta trumps the ending as far as passive goes, as far as voice goes. There's going to be a square of stops issue, okay? I don't think this is too big of a deal, but if you want to look on Mounts, page 265, he gives you a bunch of examples of this, okay? But sometimes there's a slight change in the consonant, particularly that comes up in contact with the theta. Sometimes you have a little change there. I don't think it's too difficult to still recognize what the word is, okay? So I would not suggest you spend a lot of time memorizing all of those intricacies. Just know that sometimes that can happen. You can have a letter change or so because of that theta being in the middle of the word, okay? I want you to note that there's two particularly weird aorist passives, okay? And that is lambano, which goes through this weird stem change and becomes elampthane. I can't explain that to you. That is weird. It is what it is. This is one of those strange verbs that we just have to put in the back of our notebook and study and remember. Elampthane comes from lambano. And the difficulty is when you see this on the homework, when you see this in the New Testament in context, that sort of thing, being able to identify the lexical form is really, really tough. You can go through those other steps of looking to the left, and it looks like it has an augment, and oh, there's a theta eta in the middle, and there's an ending, but if we can't understand the lexical form because it's just so unrecognizable, that becomes really tough. So we have to review that one. Lambano becomes Elampthane. Remember, lambano means I take or I receive, okay? So Elampthane means I was taken or I was received, something like that, okay? And then ago, which means I lead, becomes Aechthane. So similar, you notice none of those vowels are the same, right? The alpha becomes an eta, the gamma, because of the square of stops, becomes a key, then we have the theta eta, and that's it. Like, this is a particularly weird one because, like I said, none of the, it's essentially the same root. It's just gone through a bunch of changes, but none of the letters are the same, and so it's just really hard, okay? So Aechthane means I was led, is what that means, okay? Past, aorist, past tense, passive, aorist passive deal there. Again, that's just one that we have to put a star next to. We have to put in the back of our notebook. We have to review because it's just weird, okay? Now notice one other weird thing. Grapho and apostello are weird, and that the active is first aorist, but the passive is second aorist, okay? That's weird, okay? So grapho and apostello are weird in that way. So just be aware of that. Those two are strange as well, okay? Now let's talk about the second aorist passive indicative, okay? When we talk about second aorist, we're talking about those irregular forms, those stem changes. A lot's going to be the same. We're going to have that augment on the front. We're going to have that aorist passive tense stem, which is that change, that different stem that we learned with second aorist, okay? The tense formative here, it's not going to have the theta. It's just going to have an eta, which sounds like it's going to be strange. And that's true, but hold on just a second. I'll tell you something that'll help you here in just a minute. And then secondary active personal endings, okay? Once again, they're taking active endings. So we get agraphemen, okay? Agraphemen is how that looks. That eta is supposed to signal passive to you. Now that sounds like bad news because that's hard to see. That feels like just another thing to remember that's super annoying. But let me help you out here a little bit, okay? The New Testament only has 32 words that occur in the second aorist passive. Only 3 of those occur 50 times or more, okay? And why is 50 times or more? Why is that important? Well, that's kind of the bar that we've set for vocabulary you need to memorize. I may have said before, the New Testament has 3,000 words that show up 1, 2, or 3 times, which is so rare, they're just not worth remembering. You're never going to know all of those, right? Unless you read the New Testament every day for the rest of your life, which may be a good challenge or whatever. Sometimes you can figure out those words through context and all that kind of stuff, but there's just a lot of those words that don't show up very often, right? So we've set 50 times or more as a bar. If you memorize the words that show up 50 times or more, you know over 80% of the words in the New Testament. So that's really our target. And there's only 3 of those that even show up in the second aorist passive. And I'll show you what they are right now. One is grapho, which becomes egraphane, okay? So technically that's passive, okay? I was written is what that means. That eta on the end, could you recognize that as an aorist passive? Maybe not. This is where I say trust the process and do your best. If this one gets through, if this one gets past the goalie and you don't remember this is passive, that's not that big of a deal, okay? It doesn't show up that much to where it's going to be a critical error. We've got tools to help us in times like that. We've got checks and balances, okay? It's not like you're going to be translating a version of the New Testament without any helps or anything like that, right? So we've got things to help us, biblical software and stuff like that. Apostello is the second, which becomes apestolane. Both of those you've learned before. Again, that's hard to tell that that's passive just by looking at it. It doesn't look passive, okay? And then finally, Cairo, which means I rejoice, becomes ekarane. That's the one that you don't know yet. You haven't had that vocabulary word. The first 2 you have. Grapho and apostello you have, okay? So those are the only 3 words that show up 50 times or more. We're talking about the lexical form shows up 50 times or more. These are the only three that actually have forms in the New Testament that are aorist passive, second aorist passive. Okay? So don't stress about that too much. It doesn't show up enough to for us to worry about, for us to spend emotional energy stressing about that. It just doesn't. Okay? So let's look at the paradigm. It becomes egraphein, egraphase, egraphe, egraphemen, egraphete, and egraphason. Okay, once again, those endings that we would expect up and down the line, nothing new. Let's switch over to future, okay? We talked about the aorist and the future passive, aorist passive and future passive being formed in similar ways. You're going to see why that is right now. Let's go ahead and build future passive indicative. We're going to start with the future passive tense stem. Notice no augment, okay? Future is not past time, it's future time. So therefore, we're not going to have an augment. We're going to have a tense formative, and the tense formative is going to be similar to what we just saw, but it's going to be a little bit different too. We're going to have theta, eta, sigma. Okay, so that theta eta is going to scream what? It's going to scream passive. That sigma is what we saw as the tense formative with the future active, right? Future verbs, that was the first tense formative that we ever saw. Future verbs take that sigma as a tense formative to tell you that it's future. So you can think of those two things coming together. Okay, we've got theta eta and we've got sigma. They come together to become theta eta sigma. We've got a connecting vowel to follow the sigma to smooth things out. And then we have the primary middle passive personal endings. This one actually does take middle passive endings. It's not like aorist that jumps up and takes active even though it's passive. Okay? So you see what we got there? Luthesami. Luthesami. So now the hope, the goal, is that theta eta sigma stands out in the middle of the word and screams future passive to you, okay? How do we keep from confusing this from aorist passive? Well, three ways. One, there's no augment on the front. Two, that tense formative is a little bit different. It has the sigma in there, which the aorist will not. And then third, the endings are going to be different as well, okay? So they're similar, but they shouldn't be confused for one another for those reasons. And note, almost every time you see the theta eta sigma, you can assume the verb is future passive. That is very regular, with this one exception that's super important. Remember, we saw third person plural of the aorist passive just a few slides ago. Elutheson, okay? That son is the ending, okay? So when you see theta eta sigma, you go, oh, future passive, I got it. I don't need to do anything else. Well, let's check the front of the word. Does it have an augment on the front? If it has an augment, it can't be future. Okay, that's an aorist, secondary active ending we're looking at. So just make sure you keep those straight. Make sure you know your endings. Make sure you know those rules. That's the one place that can be tricky. Okay, so be careful about that. So here's the future passive indicative paradigm: luthesami, luthese. Notice we have the sigma in there. The sigma hasn't dropped out on the second person singular, but the iota has been subscripted. Then we get luthesetai, luthesamatha, luthesestha, and luthesantai. Those may seem like big, scary words, but they're actually just words loaded with clues to tell you what they are. Because remember, the lexical form luo is super short. We add a bunch of stuff there, which seems complex, but again, all of that stuff is telling you what it is. It's giving you clues, and it's helping you identify it, which is good news, okay? So we're going to take a little bit of a detour here. I'm going to tell you about something that's extra weird and strange. It's something that I want you to be aware of. But if you're kind of at your max for the day, if this is like enough new information, feel free to skip ahead to the ending a little bit and get my encouraging words. Or, if you need to stop this video for now and come back to it later, that's okay. But just one other wrinkle I want to show you about before we get out of here. And there's something called second future passive. You know how we have first aorist and second aorist? Mounds has something that he calls second future passive. And we build them this way, okay? We're not going to go too far into this, but we build them this way. Future passive tense stem with no augment, as we would expect. And then we have a tense formative that doesn't have the theta. It's just the eta sigma. And then a connecting vowel, and then what we would expect, our primary middle passive personal endings. So we get apostolesami is the result. So it's basically everything you would expect. It just doesn't have the theta. It's behaving exactly the same way. There is a pretty thorough chart in the Mounts textbook on pages 272 to 274 that has a bunch of these different patterns on it you might want to look at. But I only know of one word that shows up 50 times or more in the New Testament that appears in this second future passive form, and it's kairo, which becomes kairacetai, okay? It shows up a few times there, so don't worry about that too much. Just know that this is another wrinkle that shows up very rarely. Actually, in some cases, it's bad news that it shows up rarely because it's just easy to forget about. Honestly, if you do forget about this, it's not that big of a deal. We just want to have kind of a pin in our brain that we can refer back to if we encounter this sometime in the future, okay? Again, this is the kind of in-the-weeds stuff that we don't worry about too much because we know there'll be helps along the way as we encounter this stuff, okay? All right, so just another note or two before we review and then close the class period for today. There's those two words we looked at above that are just particularly weird. Ago, which becomes akthane, and lambano, which becomes elampthane in the aorist passive. I want to show you what those look like in the future, okay? Ago in the future passive becomes akthesomai, so still strange, okay? We do have the theta, eta, sigma, but the challenge of recognizing this as ago is tough because we have that square of stops with the gamma and the key, okay? And then we get lampsomai, that's actually the future middle, okay? The future passive does not show up of lambano in the New Testament, so you don't need to worry about learning it. But lampsomai is the future middle, which is strange, okay? Lampsomai. But a little bit easier maybe than what we would expect with some others, okay? So just know that these are difficult verbs that are worth reviewing, looking over every now and then when you review the weird verbs. And again, if you're creating a page of weird verbs, it's probably almost a full page at this point. If you're looking over those weekly or so at this point, when they're coming up, it's probably not that big of a deal because you get that reinforcement going on, okay? So let's go ahead and review. We finally learned the passive for the future and the aorist. We've been putting that off for a while, but I think you probably see now why we learned those together, because that theta, eta is regular, and some of the weirdness that goes on is regular, and so we begin to classify those together in our minds. We dealt with all the weirdness that goes with them, okay? And sometimes that seems like a lot, but we just take it as it comes. We use our tools, we trust the process, and we do our best, and we keep moving forward. And guys, we have fully learned 4 tenses of the Greek. We've learned present, future, imperfect, and aorist fully, and we just have one more indicative tense to learn, and that's what we're going to do next time. But until then, happy studying.